Welcome back to another deep dive into the halls of power, where the truth often hides behind carefully crafted statements and political theater. Today, we're breaking down a heated Senate Judiciary Committee hearing that exposed some of the most contentious issues facing America right now. From National Guard deployments to American cities without clear legal justification, to a $400 million luxury jet gift from Qatar that may violate the Constitution's emoluments clause, to the mysterious handling of the Epstein files investigation. This hearing had it all. The question we need to ask ourselves is simple. Are we getting the transparency and accountability we deserve from our Justice Department? Let's find out.
Consulted by the White House before they deployed National Guard troops to cities in the United States?
I am not going to discuss any internal conversations with the White House.
You won't even say whether you talked to the White House about this?
I am not going to discuss any internal conversations with the White House with you, Ranking Member.
I noticed that. What's the secret? Why do you want to keep this secret? The American people don't know the rationale behind the deployment of National Guard troops in my state. The word is, and I think it's been confirmed by the White House, they are going to transfer Texas National Guard units to the state of Illinois. What's the rationale for that?
Yeah, Chairman, as you shut down the government, you voted to shut down the government, and you're sitting here, our law enforcement officers aren't being paid. They're out there working to protect you. I wish you loved Chicago as much as you hate President Trump. And currently, the National Guard are on the way to Chicago. If you're not going to protect your citizens, President Trump will.
Let's talk about what's actually happening here. According to the exchange, Texas National Guard units are being transferred to Illinois, specifically to Chicago. This is unprecedented in several ways. First, the governor of Illinois, J.B. Pritzker, has not requested this assistance. Second, this represents federal intervention in state law enforcement matters without state consent. Third, the legal framework for such deployment remains unclear. The Posse Comitatus Act generally prohibits the use of military forces for domestic law enforcement. There are exceptions, but they're narrow and specific. The Insurrection Act is one such exception, but it requires the president to first request that the insurgents disperse. Has that happened here? We don't know because the Attorney General won't tell us. Attorney General Bondi mentioned that Chicago has a murder rate 5 times higher than New York's, with 571 homicides last year. These are real problems that deserve real solutions. But the question isn't whether Chicago has crime problems. The question is whether unilateral federal military deployment without state cooperation is constitutional, legal, or even effective. Let's talk about what's actually happening here. According to the exchange, Texas National Guard units are being transferred to Illinois, specifically to Chicago. This is unprecedented in several ways. First, the governor of Illinois, J.B. Pritzker, has not requested this assistance. Second, this represents federal intervention in state law enforcement matters without state consent. Third, the legal framework for such deployment remains unclear. The Posse Comitatus Act generally prohibits the use of military forces for domestic law enforcement. There are exceptions, but they're narrow and specific. The Insurrection Act is one such exception, but it requires the president to first request that the insurgents disperse. Has that happened here? We don't know because the Attorney General won't tell us. Attorney General Bondi mentioned that Chicago has a murder rate 5 times higher than New York's, with 571 homicides last year. These are real problems that deserve real solutions. But the question isn't whether Chicago has crime problems. The question is whether unilateral federal military deployment without state cooperation is constitutional, legal, or even effective. Think about this for a moment. If a Republican governor didn't want federal troops in their state, would this administration force them anyway? The principle of federalism should apply equally, regardless of which party controls the state house. Senator Durbin raised another critical point that got lost in the heated exchange: federal law enforcement grants. He specifically mentioned the high-intensity drug trafficking areas program, which the administration's budget proposes cutting from $300 million to $196 million, a reduction of roughly 1/3. Attorney General Bondi's response was that the program is being transferred to the Office of Justice Programs and will continue. But here's the problem. Transferring programs between offices often means restructuring, delays, and uncertainty for the local agencies that depend on these funds. If you're genuinely concerned about public safety, cutting federal support to local law enforcement seems counterproductive. The Attorney General challenged Senator Durbin to name specific grants that have been cut in Illinois, promising to work with him to restore them. On the surface, this sounds reasonable. But it places the burden on individual senators to track every grant cut in their state and personally intervene. Hardly an efficient or transparent way to run federal law enforcement funding. Now we move to what might be the most constitutionally significant issue raised in this hearing, the $400 million luxury jet from Qatar. Let's break down why this matters. The Constitution's Emoluments Clause exists for a specific reason: to prevent foreign governments from influencing American officials through gifts and payments. The founders understood that foreign powers would try to curry favor with American leaders, and they built in protections against this. According to Senator Durbin, President Trump accepted a $400 million luxury jet from the royal family of Qatar for temporary use as Air Force One, with plans to eventually gift it to the Trump Presidential Library Foundation. This raises several red flags. First, Attorney General Bondi previously disclosed that she had represented Qatar in some capacity before becoming Attorney General. Specifically, she worked on anti-human trafficking efforts related to the World Cup. While that work may have been legitimate and even commendable, it creates a potential conflict of interest when she's now advising the president on whether he can accept gifts from that same foreign government. Second, the value here is staggering. We're not talking about a ceremonial gift or a token of friendship. We're talking about a $400 million aircraft. To put that in perspective, that's more than the entire annual budget of many federal agencies. Third, Senator Durbin sent a letter to the Attorney General 5 months ago asking for the legal rationale behind approving this gift. 5 months later, he still hasn't received an answer. The Attorney General cited confidentiality of advice to the president. But here's the problem with that argument. The American people have a right to know whether their president is complying with the Constitution. Do you think a $400 million gift from a foreign government should be subject to public scrutiny, or should such matters remain confidential? The Attorney General stated that the Office of Legal Counsel was consulted but wouldn't provide any details. She also didn't directly answer whether she consulted with the Department of Justice Ethics Office before providing this advice, a standard procedure when potential conflicts of interest exist. Perhaps the most explosive part of this hearing involved the Jeffrey Epstein investigation files. This issue has captivated public attention for years, and for good reason. Epstein's crimes, his connections to powerful people, and the circumstances of his death have raised countless questions that remain unanswered. Attorney General Bondi made headlines in February when she claimed that the Epstein client list was sitting on my desk right now for review. This statement generated enormous public interest and expectations. Finally, people thought we might get answers about who was involved in Epstein's criminal enterprise. But what happened next? According to Senator Durbin, the Justice Department held a major media event at the White House and released already public information. No client list, no new revelations, nothing that wasn't already known. The Attorney General's explanation was that she had said she hadn't reviewed the materials yet and that their subsequent memo clarified there was no client list. But this raises more questions than it answers. If there's no client list, what was sitting on her desk? What materials was she referring to? Why make such a public statement if there was nothing new to reveal? According to a whistleblower who made a protected disclosure to Senator Durbin's office, Attorney General Bondi pushed the FBI to review approximately 100,000 Epstein-related records on an arbitrarily short deadline in March. Furthermore, the FBI was allegedly directed to flag any documents that mentioned President Trump. Let's pause here and think about what this means. If true, this suggests a politically motivated review of investigative materials, exactly the kind of politicization of the Justice Department that should concern everyone, regardless of party affiliation. What do you think? Should the Justice Department be reviewing criminal investigation files with instructions to flag mentions of the current president? The July 7th memo that resulted from this review was unsigned. Senator Durbin asked why, and Attorney General Bondi simply stated it came from the FBI and the Department of Justice, without explaining the unusual lack of signature. Unsigned memos from major federal agencies are rare, especially on matters of significant public interest. When Senator Durbin asked who gave the order to flag records related to President Trump, Attorney General Bondi refused to answer, stating, "I'm not going to discuss anything about that with you, Senator." This is where we need to step back and consider the bigger picture. The Epstein case involves allegations of sex trafficking of minors, potential blackmail of powerful individuals, and questions about whether justice was properly served. The American people deserve to know what the government knows, especially when the Attorney General makes public statements suggesting new revelations are coming. The hearing took another contentious turn when Attorney General Bondi accused Senator Durbin of having refused Republican requests to release Epstein flight logs in 2023 and 2024. She even went so far as to ask if Senator Durbin had taken campaign donations from Reid Hoffman, whom she described as a huge Epstein friend. Senator Marsha Blackburn then interjected, contradicting Durbin's account and stating that she had repeatedly requested the flight logs in writing and that the committee had been shut down to avoid releasing them. Senator Durbin countered that he had asked for any document requests in writing and never received them, and that committee business ended because Republicans invoked the 2-hour rule. This back and forth highlights a deeper problem. Even basic facts about what happened in committee proceedings are now disputed along partisan lines. When senators can't even agree on whether requests were made in writing or why committee business ended, how can the public trust that they're getting the truth about more complex matters? Attorney General Bondi and Republican senators brought up an interesting historical comparison. They noted that in 2016, then-Senator Grassley raised concerns about potential emoluments clause violations by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, based on her financial disclosures showing her husband participated in at least 62 events with connections to foreign governments while she was Secretary of State. This is actually a fair point to raise. If we're going to be concerned about potential foreign influence through gifts and payments, we should apply those standards consistently, regardless of party. The emoluments clause doesn't say this only applies to presidents we don't like. It applies to all federal officials. However, two wrongs don't make a right. If there were concerns about potential violations during the Obama administration, that doesn't excuse potential violations now. The proper response is to ensure transparency and compliance across all administrations, not to use past controversies to deflect from current ones. What we witnessed in this hearing is part of a broader pattern that should concern every American: the erosion of transparency and accountability in government. Throughout the hearing, Attorney General Bondi repeatedly refused to answer basic questions, won't discuss conversations with the White House about National Guard deployments, won't provide the legal rationale for accepting the Qatar jet, won't discuss who ordered the flagging of Trump-related documents in the Epstein files, won't explain why the July 7th memo was unsigned. Each refusal might have its own justification: executive privilege, confidentiality of legal advice, protection of ongoing investigations. But taken together, they create a pattern of opacity that makes oversight nearly impossible. Think about this. If the Attorney General can refuse to explain the legal basis for major decisions, what check does Congress have? What check do the American people have? The framers of our Constitution created a system of checks and balances specifically to prevent any one branch from becoming too powerful. Congressional oversight is one of those checks. When executive branch officials refuse to answer questions from Congress, that system breaks down. One of the most troubling aspects of this hearing was the tendency to respond to substantive questions with personal attacks. When Senator Durbin asked about National Guard deployments, Attorney General Bondi responded by saying, "I wish you loved Chicago as much as you hate President Trump." When he asked about the Qatar jet, she brought up Reid Hoffman and campaign donations. These aren't answers. They're deflections designed to change the subject and put the questioner on the defensive. This tactic has become increasingly common in political discourse, but it's particularly problematic when used by the nation's chief law enforcement officer. The Attorney General should be able to defend her decisions on the merits, not by attacking the motives of those asking questions. Let's zoom out and consider what's really at stake in these exchanges. We're not just talking about political theater or partisan bickering. We're talking about fundamental questions of constitutional governance. Can the president accept massive gifts from foreign governments? Under what circumstances can federal military forces be deployed to American cities without state consent? How should the Justice Department handle politically sensitive investigations? What level of transparency should the American people expect from their government? These aren't Republican or Democratic questions. They're American questions. The answers we get will shape the balance of power in our system for years to come. Attorney General Bondi made a valid point about crime in Chicago. With 571 homicides last year and a murder rate 5 times higher than New York's, there's clearly a serious public safety problem. No one disputes that. But the question isn't whether there's a problem, it's about the proper solution. Does unilateral federal intervention without state cooperation actually reduce crime? Or does it create constitutional crises and undermine the federal-state partnership that's supposed to exist in our system? History offers some guidance here. Federal-state law enforcement partnerships work best when they're collaborative, when federal resources supplement rather than supplant state efforts, and when there's clear legal authority and mutual consent. Forced federal intervention, especially using military forces, has a much more troubled history. The dispute over law enforcement grants also deserves closer examination. Attorney General Bondi said that only 7% of grants have been cut and offered to work with any senator to restore grants that protect law enforcement or citizens. That sounds reasonable on its face, but Senator Durbin pointed to specific cuts, like the HIDTA program reduction from $300 million to $196 million. The Attorney General responded that the program is being transferred to a different office and will continue, but transfers often mean disruption, uncertainty, and delays for the local agencies that depend on these funds. Here's the fundamental question. If the administration is genuinely committed to law enforcement and public safety, why cut federal support to local agencies? And if the cuts are necessary for budget reasons, shouldn't that be clearly explained rather than disputed? The allegation that a whistleblower reported the FBI was directed to flag Trump-related documents in the Epstein files is particularly serious. Whistleblower protections exist precisely because we need people inside government to be able to report wrongdoing without fear of retaliation. If this allegation is true, it suggests the Justice Department was conducting a politically motivated review of criminal investigation files. If it's false, the Attorney General should be able to clearly and definitively say so. Instead, she refused to discuss it at all. Do you think the Attorney General should be required to respond to whistleblower allegations, or should such matters remain confidential? The problem with blanket refusals to discuss anything is that they leave the American people unable to distinguish between legitimate confidentiality concerns and cover-ups of wrongdoing. Transparency doesn't mean revealing every detail of every investigation, but it does mean being able to explain the legal and ethical framework within which decisions are made. The fact that the July 7th memo on Epstein was unsigned is actually more significant than it might seem. Government documents, especially those making important factual or legal determinations, are typically signed by responsible officials. Signatures create accountability. They mean someone is putting their name and reputation behind the conclusions. An unsigned memo allows for plausible deniability. If the conclusions later turn out to be wrong or incomplete, no individual official can be held accountable. This is precisely why important government documents are supposed to be signed. Senator Durbin asked whether Attorney General Bondi consulted with the Justice Department's Ethics Office before advising the president on the Qatar jet. This is a standard question when potential conflicts of interest exist. The Attorney General didn't give a clear answer. She said the Office of Legal Counsel provides confidential advice to the president, but that doesn't answer whether she consulted with ethics officials about her own potential conflict given her previous work for Qatar. Ethics consultations are supposed to be routine precisely to avoid even the appearance of impropriety. The fact that we can't get a straight answer about whether such a consultation occurred is itself troubling. One of the most depressing aspects of this hearing is how it illustrates the deep partisan divide in American politics. Democrats and Republicans couldn't even agree on basic facts about what happened in committee proceedings. They have completely different interpretations of the same events. Senator Durbin sees a pattern of stonewalling and refusal to provide accountability. Republicans see a senator who's more interested in attacking the administration than in solving problems like crime in Chicago. Both sides can point to legitimate grievances. But when everything becomes a partisan food fight, the American people lose. We lose the ability to have serious discussions about serious issues. We lose faith in our institutions. We lose trust in our leaders. So where do we go from here? What can be done to restore transparency and accountability? First, Congress needs to reassert its oversight role. That means insisting on answers to legitimate questions, using subpoena power when necessary, and holding officials in contempt when they refuse to comply with legal obligations. Second, the Justice Department needs to recognize that it serves the American people, not just the president. That means providing transparency about major decisions, explaining the legal reasoning behind actions, and submitting to proper oversight. Third, the American people need to demand better from all of our leaders. We need to insist on substance over personal attacks, on transparency over stonewalling, on principled positions over partisan point scoring. Let's return to the constitutional issues at the heart of this hearing: the Emoluments Clause, the limits on military deployment for domestic law enforcement, the oversight role of Congress. These aren't abstract legal concepts. They're fundamental protections that the founders built into our system to preserve liberty and prevent tyranny. When a president accepts a $400 million gift from a foreign government and we can't get a clear explanation of the legal justification, that's not just a political controversy. It's a potential constitutional crisis. When National Guard troops are deployed to American cities without clear legal authority or state consent, that's not just a policy dispute. It's a fundamental question about the proper role of military force in a free society. When the Attorney General refuses to answer questions from Congress about major decisions, that's not just a partisan squabble, it's a breakdown of the checks and balances that protect our democracy. The handling of the Epstein files speaks to a larger issue of public trust. For years, people have suspected that powerful individuals were protected, that justice wasn't fully served, that the truth was being hidden. When the Attorney General makes a public statement suggesting new revelations are coming and then nothing materializes, it reinforces those suspicions. When she refuses to answer questions about how the files were reviewed and why, it makes people think there's something to hide. Maybe there's nothing nefarious going on. Maybe all the decisions were proper and justified. But without transparency, how can the public know? Trust isn't built through secrecy. It's built through openness and accountability. Let's be clear about one thing. Chicago does have serious crime problems that need to be addressed. The 571 homicides last year represent real lives lost, real families devastated, real communities traumatized. These aren't just statistics. They're human tragedies. But the question is how to address these problems effectively. Does sending National Guard troops without the governor's consent actually reduce crime? Or does it create a constitutional crisis while doing little to address the root causes of violence? Effective crime reduction requires sustained investment in law enforcement, community programs, education, economic opportunity, and social services. It requires federal, state, local cooperation, not federal imposition. It requires evidence-based strategies, not political gestures. The issues raised in this hearing have implications far beyond the specific questions asked. They're about the kind of government we want to have and the kind of country we want to be. Do we want a government that operates transparently, that explains its decisions, that submits to proper oversight? Or are we comfortable with officials who refuse to answer questions and attack those who ask them? Do we want to maintain the constitutional limits on executive power, or are we willing to let those limits erode in the name of efficiency or security? Do we want equal application of the law and constitutional principles, or are we okay with double standards based on partisan affiliation? Throughout this hearing, we saw a pattern of personal attacks substituting for substantive answers. This is corrosive to democratic discourse. When officials respond to legitimate questions by questioning the motives of those asking, it shuts down debate and makes oversight impossible. Attorney General Bondi is a smart, experienced lawyer. She's capable of defending her decisions on the merits. The fact that she chose instead to attack Senator Durbin's motives suggests either that the merits aren't defensible or that she's adopted a political strategy of deflection over explanation. Neither possibility is reassuring for those who believe in accountable government. We've covered a lot of ground today. From National Guard deployments to constitutional violations, from the Epstein files to questions about transparency and accountability. These aren't easy issues, and reasonable people can disagree about the right answers. But what we should all agree on is that the American people deserve answers. We deserve to know the legal basis for major government decisions. We deserve transparency about potential conflicts of interest. We deserve officials who will explain their actions rather than attacking those who question them. The hearing we analyzed today showed us a Justice Department that seems more interested in deflecting questions than answering them, more focused on political attacks than substantive explanations. That should concern all of us, regardless of our political affiliations. Senator Durbin ended his questioning by saying, "Eventually, you're going to have to answer for your conduct in this. You won't do it today, but eventually you will." Let's hope he's right. Let's hope that accountability isn't just a word we use in political speeches, but a principle we actually enforce. The questions raised in this hearing won't go away just because they weren't answered today. The constitutional issues remain, the public concerns persist, the need for transparency and accountability continues. As citizens, we have a responsibility to pay attention, to ask questions, to demand better from our leaders. We can't just tune out when things get complicated or partisan. Democracy requires engaged citizens who hold their government accountable. So what did you think of this hearing? Were you satisfied with the Attorney General's responses, or do you think she should have been more forthcoming? Do you believe the National Guard deployments are justified, or do they raise constitutional concerns? Should the Qatar jet gift be subject to more scrutiny? And what about the Epstein files? Do you think we're getting the full story? These are the questions we need to keep asking until we get satisfactory answers. These are the issues that will define the balance of power in our government for years to come. Thank you for taking the time to watch this analysis and to think seriously about these important issues. In a time when so much political content is designed to confirm our biases and inflame our emotions, we hope this provided a more thoughtful examination of what's really at stake. If you found this analysis valuable, we encourage you to share it with others who care about constitutional governance and government accountability. These conversations need to happen not just in Senate hearing rooms, but in living rooms and coffee shops across America. Stay informed, stay engaged, and never stop asking questions. That's how we preserve the democratic republic the founders gave us. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.